Amid public discourse centered around the ways in which we are constantly inundated with media, information, text, I want to talk about wholes and the way that these wholes are often themselves centered around fantasies of social wholes with a W. In short, I want to ask initially, to begin with, the question of why so many proposals on the center left of the political spectrum take on a particular form. And this is the particular form. I'll give an instance of it. Not only would it be better for us, the workers, ... to get a pay raise, to get healthcare, to have stable employment, to be allowed sick leave during COVID-19. Not only would it be better for us, the workers, maybe you can complete the sentence in your own head, or maybe you've even generated some version of the sentence yourself, to have some elementary form of rights, but, and I wonder if people can then generate the second half of the sentence. And the second half of the sentence, of course, is, but it would be better for the bosses too, and for the whole of society, right? That's the sentence. Not only would it be better for me to have sick leave, but it would be better for you, my employer, because I could do a better job working for you and not infect all of my other coworkers with COVID. So the structure of the sentence is, not only would this be better for me, but it would be better for society as a whole. Okay, so I think that introduces the question of the social whole. I know that bosses very occasionally, when they think they can get away with it, also can use a form of this logic, but it differs in some key respects, which I'll kind of bring out. I recently sat in a negotiating meeting with the HR of my university, who argued, quote, if we shorten the appeal time for workers facing redundancy, we will reduce a lot of uncertainty on those workers. So I thought this was a really interesting argument. It points to a new managerial logic which weaponizes mental health, and I think we're starting to see the ways in which now the state and even various capitalist entities are starting to use mental health as a way to construct, for example, rationales for why we should be working in unsafe conditions. We have to provide mental health support to the students, for example, by being on campus and possibly contracting COVID. And the length of an appeal here also is seen as something that damages mental health. So until 2020, I hadn't seen this so effectively be weaponized, but now we're starting to see, I think, the potential of using mental health issues against employees. So I'll run this statement back. If we shorten the appeal time for workers facing redundancy, in other words, we reduce the possibility of those workers' appeals being heard, then we reduce a lot of uncertainty on those workers and the potential for negative mental health effects. So the boss, in a sense, is making an opposite structural suggestion to what we've seen above, where workers make an appeal to the social whole. To the worker who might propose a better appeal process, which perhaps might help them remain in their job, the boss is saying the appeal process itself is bad for your mental health, and we're actually helping your mental health by introducing certainty in firing you and not leaving you in limbo. And any complaint about the appeals process or the unfairness of an appeal can now be channeled in reverse into a critique of appeals as such. Right. So a critique of the appeals process as being hard on workers can then reinforce the idea that, well, we should really not have an appeals process. The manager has neatly suggested, in the interest of your own mental health, you'd better get fired as quickly as possible so that you don't have to go through the nasty, uncertain appeals process. But there's something missing, however, from the boss's version of the same formula. And generally in these sorts of instances where something's missing, we know it's for a reason, right? So while the worker's version of the statement lays out both sets of interests, it would be better for me and better for you. If I got a raise, I'd be happier, I'd be more productive, I'd make you more money. So it lays out both sets of interests and ties it into a social whole. The boss's statement is opaque on one very obvious point, which is their own interest and their own desire. They don't add to their statement on cutting appeals short, we reduce a lot of uncertainty on workers, and also it makes it much easier for us to fire you, which is of course what we want. That in theory would be the realistic inverse of the structure proposed by the worker, but the bosses rarely do this. Usually they're able to define the rules of the game by their own interests without introducing the question of their desire or their interests. So outside of the situations where workers' rights are actually being included now into the culture of the company itself, it's a different kind of branding, which we see almost exclusively in tech and venture capital founded startups. And I'd be happy to discuss why that is, but I don't think we have time to discuss why there's particular sectors of the economy that actually do kind of introduce questions of the interests of the company vis-a-vis the interests of the workers. And that has to do with this idea of disrupting the economy. But you very rarely see these gestures from corporations towards the idea of their company doing things for both the good and of the workers and the bosses at the same time. So nearly exclusively when we hear this line, it comes from a kind of center-left, social democratic, Keynesian public policy, social partnership approach that says, look, taking care of our environment wouldn't just be good for the environment, it would also be good for business, right? So, so there's a particular subject that tends to make this appeal. And it deeply concerns me that in making this statement, they're not just making an empty appeal, right? They're demonstrating on some level that they want to say this, or that potentially they believe it in an ideological sense, even if it's a front for trying to potentially organize around environmental impact or any of the other things that they claim to want. In making that reference to the interests of capital, they are producing that ideology in some level. And they're producing themselves as subjects capable of making this argument. I'd like to talk about the way in which the production of this ideology of social whole is also an implicit claim to governance and the legitimacy to govern, right? So I, the social democrat, I can take the social whole into account. I can take the worker and the boss's interests both into account. Therefore, I'm the one who really should be running society. I'm really capable of running society for the good of all. The problem that I'd like to introduce into this is that there is no all in this sense. There is no social whole. And I want to point out a crucial difference between this attempt to resolve everything into a whole and the standpoint of capitalism, in as much as we can see that the economic system itself does not have a standpoint per se in the way that it's represented here. So this is also what some of the attempts to portray the interests of individual economic actors or the point of view of the boss also misses. The boss does not have a point of view in the way that the workers might have a point of view. The boss doesn't have an investment in, quote, society as a whole. They rationally attempt to act along the lines of the system within their own purview. And it would be impossible to understand what supposedly represents itself as capitalism's irrationality without understanding the ways that capitalist rationality has no obligation to represent the standpoint of a social whole. Individual rational actors within capitalism, including workers at present, are not functionally organized around any of these questions of the whole. And this lack of secure rationale for the public sphere within capitalism itself is also what's given rise to the idea of the neoliberal state as being a hollow state. So in a sense, there's like a weakness of the state in as much as there's no real intersection between the activity of all of these individual rational actors and then the kind of purported bundling of all those individual interests into this supposed whole. So I think in that sense, I think we could see these fantasies of social democracy and social whole as fantasies of law and the idea of making the state into potentially a sympathetic subject, which is capable of kind of recognizing and bringing about a harmony between these individual interests. But I think we should be deeply suspicious of whether that's possible. So turning to Lukács, I want to propose a different term to describe the all. So Lukács proposes the term totality to describe the total configuration of social and economic relations. So unlike a whole, and kind of Jordan, you spoke to this a little bit in your introduction, totality is implying that these relations are internally fragmented and antagonistic. And so to consider the system as a totality is not the same as implying that it's harmonious or capable of being rendered into one kind of framework. But this is a purely formal shift, like a linguistic shift from whole to totality, unless we understand the difference and what informs Lukács and what he actually means by this. So I'm going to cover a lot of stuff really quickly. But I want to look at a little bit of what he introduces on Kant in Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat. So I'd like to paraphrase this a little bit, but I also want to gesture to the possibility of a Lacanian reading, even though I'm not going to necessarily set this out. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on about the image, about reality, about the questions of accessing reality, and also about the symbolic order that I think if anyone has the time to kind of go back over Reification and Consciousness of the Proletariat from like a Lacanian perspective, I think would be very productive. So what Lukács suggests in Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat is that the dual character of irrationality and rationality that we see within capitalism, so this contradiction between every individual aspect of the system is highly rational, but it produces massive amounts of irrationality. So he suggests that there's this constant process of within capitalism of every aspect of the economic system undergoing refinement and specialization. But this is also simultaneously totally detached from the impact that this could have on the life of individuals within it, or the use values or the practical aspects of life, or even the totality So in other words, this division between increasingly abstract and objective laws, which themselves mystify or reify human labor and human life, this mirrors, in a sense, philosophy up through Kant. So he suggests that the ways in which capitalism divides between this highly rational edifice and this extremely irrational and unapproachable part of the system, which is life itself, this mirrors Kantian antinomies. So the ways in which within Kantian antinomy, there's an irreconcilable divide between reason in its most advanced form and the world of phenomena in itself. Lukács suggests this is exactly what's taking place under the capitalist economy as well. And so this is what he suggests becomes the major limitation of bourgeois thought. These forms of reason cannot cohere to address the aspects of life that are within the totality. So I will kind of read a little bit. I'll just see if I can find a quote from Lukács. There's this part where he talks about, and I'd like, if you want to go over this in your own time, there's a lot. It begins with talking about images of the whole. And again, there's so much that's productive there for Lacan, but I don't have time. But he says, even though this criticism deserves refutation in its naive form, the idea that science has torn our world apart and makes it incomprehensible, the more intricate a modern science becomes and the better it understands itself methodologically, the more resolutely it will turn its back on the ontological problems of its own sphere of influence and eliminate them from the realm where it has achieved some insight. So in other words, the questions that relate to the reason for having these advanced forms of rationality become excluded. The more highly developed it becomes, the more scientific, the more it will become a formally closed system of partial laws. It will then find that the world lying beyond its own confines, and particularly the material base, which is its task to understand, its own concrete underlying reality, lies both methodologically and in principle beyond its grasp. So in this regard, Lukács' solution is also not incompatible with Lacan. So I want to look at his solution in the final paragraph of his essay. He suggests that essentially the question is one of consciousness, and says history is at its least automatic when it's the consciousness of the proletariat that's at issue. So he suggests that the development of a consciousness, class consciousness, is what could unite the antinomy between theory and practice. And theory, and also theory and essence, essentially, like reason and essence. So he says that the only way that you can get through this is essentially in action. The truth that the old intuitive mechanistic materialism, so, a certain critique of particular kind of scientific socialism or whatever, could not grasp, turns out to be doubly true for the proletariat, namely that it can be transformed and liberated only by its own actions, and that, quote, the educator must himself be educated. The objective economic evolution could do no more than create the position of the proletariat in the production process. And the reason why Lukács suggests that the proletarian consciousness is what will have the capacity to undo these antinomies of bourgeois thought is precisely because their own consciousness has been excluded from the production process. So if you're already part of the system of managerial logic, then your consciousness in some sense is part of that process, and so it's very difficult to stand outside it. However, Lukács suggests that the very alienation and exploitation that creates the proletariat is what gives ground for the development of class consciousness. And then he says the objective evolution, okay, so the fact that there are people whose consciousness is not fully included in these processes could only give the proletariat the opportunity and the necessity to change society. And I think it's interesting that necessity doesn't necessarily lead to action, opportunity and necessity. But then he suggests that any transformation could only come about as the product of free action. So that's his conclusion. So I find that very fascinating. Necessity, however, leads up to free action. So what are the kind of consequences of this? I think there are a few, but I'm just going to look at some indications of how this emerges in poetry, if I have a minute to do so. There's a couple of interesting poems that I want to point to that I think indicate some of these questions of consciousness. One is in some of the poetry by Toby Martinez de las Rivas. And if people have been following this scandal, Martinez de las Rivas was essentially, he was a contender for the Forward Prize quite recently. And the question came up as to whether his poems represented a kind of fascist outlook. And this was, I don't think this ever was really satisfactorily resolved. There were a series of essays that went back and forth. But I'm not sure that in terms of what the subject's supposed to know thinks, whether there's been a conclusion, you know, from that subject as to whether we can say that he's a fascist or not. But one of the poems that de las Rivas wrote that was considered significant in terms of taking a political stance is a poem called Elegy for the Young Hitler. And so there's, I was able to find this poem, but I think it's been scrubbed from the internet. And actually, like, it's quite difficult now. So I have a copy if anybody wants a copy of this poem to see what it says. What's interesting about it to me is not just the content of the poem, but also the ways in which the discussions around whether or not it's a fascist poem quote the poem with the original having been removed. So de las Rivas quotes a few lines from the poem, but he doesn't reproduce it in full, thus making it impossible to really make a judgment that isn't mediated through somebody else's presentation of the poem. So the reason why I want to bring this up is that I think there's something about Lukács's conclusions around action that comes out only essentially in political extremes presented within poetry right now. In other poetry, you see essentially, I would say, like a reinforcement of the view that we saw previously, which is that poetry should represent a social whole. But only kind of on the fringes can you see the emergence of something else. So, de las Rivas's Elegy for the Young Hitler ends with one line: sterile paved lust garden that in my tongue is the garden of pleasure. And so this became a crucial moment over the debate of the meaning of the poem. The Elegy for the Young Hitler, obviously there's a certain contingent of readers who felt that writing anything about Hitler that was even remotely sympathetic is indication of a kind of fascist approach. Rivas argued that he was representing the drawbacks of Nazism by saying that they were sterile. However, I find it interesting, and I think this is probably the most convincing reading, that in reproducing a critique of Nazism as not sufficiently attentive to nature, pleasure, and potentially, not religiously attentive enough. I mean, he's reproducing a kind of fascist logic through the critique of Nazism. So I think that would be one thing to look at when thinking about Martinez de las Rivas. But I also want to point to one more of his poems where there's an interesting theological moment. And it has to do again with this question of agency and where agency lies in the political body and the social whole. So this is at the very end of one of his, one of the sections from a longer poem called Titan, All Is Still, and this can be found online in the Poetry Foundation. 1, and let him that is athirst come. 2, and let him that heareth say come. 3, and let the dawn thunder up in the street while you are sleeping with the first cars sauntering by and the dustmen and women whistling. Lord, I will stand before you when you wish in death's little house, and you will eat my pronoun. So I think there's something to be said about that, the figuration of agency there, which is certainly a figuration of agency, but it's a figuration of agency in a kind of theological overcoming that potentially suggests the reduction of an individual authority to the authority of a potentially dark reckoning from God, which I actually think is completely compatible with some of the QAnon storm stuff, but it's a little bit better written. The idea that there's going to be this storm that you just sort of have to submit to on a religious basis. So I'd like to contrast that with one other poem, and then I'll conclude. It's a poem by Bertolt Brecht on the death of Lenin. And I think there's some interesting potential in this that Brecht didn't fully pursue around thinking about the figuration of agency. So it starts with a soldier of the death watch, so runs the story, told his comrades, I did not want to believe it. I went inside and shouted in his ear, Ilyich, the exploiters are on their way. He did not move. Now I knew that he has expired. There's a particular figuration of desire there to me as something that can literally animate the body, and the sense that Lenin's desire to combat exploitation was so powerful that it's what created a particular life force. There's one other little moment that I find interesting in this poem that could have gone on. The weak do not fight. This is section 7. The weak do not fight. The stronger fight on, perhaps for an hour. Those are stronger still fight for many years. The strongest fight on all their life. These are indispensable. It follows a kind of mathematical formula. I would be quite interested in seeing whether Brecht could then pursue something about the undead nature of desire, and whether there's something to say about the strongest fighting on potentially after death.